On April 20th, 2020, the price of oil didn't just fall. It went to negative $37. Producers were paying people to take their oil away. A small town in Oklahoma called Cushing, the delivery point for every US oil futures contract, had run out of storage. Traders holding contracts that expired the next day faced a choice. Take physical delivery of 1,000 barrels with nowhere to put them, or pay someone to make the problem go away. They paid. The most fought-over substance on Earth had become a liability overnight. And the reason it happened has almost nothing to do with COVID, and everything to do with a century-long fight over one choke point. This is the story of oil. Who found it, who controlled it, who weaponized it, and why, after 160 years, we still can't stabilize the price of the one commodity that touches everything you buy. At every turning point, it comes down to one question: who controls the valve? In the middle of the 19th century, the world was running out of light. Whale populations were collapsing, coal gas was expensive and dangerous, and for ordinary people, darkness after sunset was becoming the norm. They didn't want crude oil. They wanted something to burn. The answer came from an unlikely source. Crude oil, a substance that had been seeping out of the ground for centuries, mostly treated as a nuisance, could be distilled into kerosene. Clean, bright, and cheap enough for millions of households. That solved the problem, and created a much bigger one. In 1859, Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. What followed was chaos. Boomtowns erupted overnight. Speculators poured in. Oil flooded the market faster than anyone could store or move it, and prices swung by orders of magnitude. Fortunes made and wiped out in weeks. But one man saw something different in the chaos. John D. Rockefeller didn't drill, he refined. And then he made a move that most of his competitors wouldn't understand until it was too late. He negotiated secret deals with the railroads. Standard Oil got a rebate on every barrel it shipped, paying less than the listed rate. But the real weapon was the drawback. For every barrel a competitor shipped on the same railroad, Standard Oil received a portion of that fee too. His rivals were literally funding his advantage every time they moved oil. By the time they figured out the terms, it was already over. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of America's refining capacity. 90%. One company, one man. Every barrel of oil in the country passed through his system, or it didn't move. He didn't need to own what was underground. He owned everything between the wellhead and the customer. And if you tried to compete, you were paying him for the privilege. But monopoly only works when the product stays domestic. The moment oil crossed borders, Rockefeller's kind of power stopped working, and a far more dangerous game began. In 1908, Henry Ford's Model T changed what oil was for. Almost overnight, gasoline, once a worthless byproduct of kerosene production, became the most valuable thing a refinery could produce. Oil was no longer about lighting homes. It was about moving people and machines. And then it became about winning wars. In 1911, Winston Churchill made one of the most consequential gambles in military history. He ordered the Royal Navy to convert from coal to oil. Faster ships, greater range, a decisive edge over any coal-powered fleet. But Britain had no domestic oil, not a single major field. Churchill had just traded Britain's security for speed, and the bill would come due. To reduce the vulnerability, Britain took a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the forerunner of BP. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was a matter of national survival, And from now on, every major power would treat it that way. By the First World War, oil-powered mobility had become decisive, and by the Second World War, it was iron law: reach fuel or lose mobility. Germany's push toward the Caucasus and North Africa was shaped by this logic. The Wehrmacht went in with limited fuel and a plan built around capturing more. When the oil fields at Baku stayed out of reach, the clock started winning. Japan faced the same arithmetic from the other direction. In 1941, the United States cut off oil exports to Japan, most of its supply gone overnight. Japanese planners believed they had roughly a year of reserves, maybe less for the Navy, before operations became impossible. The result was Pearl Harbor. Not ideology, not territory, oil arithmetic. Oil doesn't start wars, but it decides how they end. The valve moved into the hands of states, and they were willing to redraw borders to secure it. But winning the war created a new problem. Who would control the peace? After the war, the center of gravity shifted decisively. Saudi Arabia's Gawa field, discovered in 1948, turned out to be the largest conventional oil field ever found. Kuwait, Iraq, Iran. One after another, the Gulf states revealed reserves that dwarfed anything in Pennsylvania or Texas. The oil was there. The question was, who profits? A small group of Western majors dominated the concessions and the pricing architecture for much of the international oil trade. Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, Mobil, Gulf, and Texaco, the so-called Seven Sisters, didn't just pump oil, they engineered the rules of payment and pricing. And here's the part most people don't know. For the next 30 years, one single rule would decide entire national budgets. The mechanism was the posted price. The companies set it. Producing countries had to accept it. And since posted prices determined taxes and royalties, whoever set the posted price decided national revenue. Here's the catch. The posted price didn't have to match the market price. It only had to be accepted. And it always was, because the producing countries had no alternative. Think about what that means in practice. Schools, hospitals, roads, military budgets, all determined by a number announced in a boardroom in New York or London. Imagine your country runs on oil revenue, and you wake up to a cable from London saying the price has been cut 10%. One announcement, instant austerity. Not because you ran out of oil, because someone else decided it was worth less. Massive profits flowed west. Producing nations received a fraction. If you control volume but not price, you're a tenant in your own house. And these tenants were getting angry. In 1960, after the Seven Sisters unilaterally cut posted prices without consulting a single producing government, 5 nations formed OPEC: Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. They didn't form OPEC to get rich. They formed it to stop being humiliated. The West barely noticed. The cartel was small, fragmented, and had no enforcement mechanism. That dismissal would turn out to be the most expensive miscalculation in economic history. If you remember one thing from this video, remember this. By the early 1970s, the entire Western economy, cheap flights, cheap food, cheap plastic in every product you touch, was built on the assumption that oil would stay cheap forever. Nobody had stress-tested what would happen if the people who actually owned the oil decided to turn the tap off. They were about to find out. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur. When the United States backed Israel, Arab OPEC members imposed an oil embargo on the US and its allies. Prices quadrupled within months. Inflation surged. Factories cut shifts. Unemployment lines grew. The shock wasn't the missing barrels, it was the panic. Oil demand is inelastic in the short run. People can't stop driving to work or heating their homes because the price doubled last week. A small supply cut, or even the fear of one, causes a massive price spike. For the first time, ordinary Americans felt the geopolitics of oil in their daily lives, not as a headline, as a line stretching around the block, and a grocery bill that made no sense. 6 years later, it happened again. The Iranian Revolution took millions of barrels of Iranian production offline virtually overnight. Prices doubled a second time. Western economies plunged into recession. Governments scrambled to diversify. North Sea drilling accelerated. Alaskan oil flowed. Nuclear programs expanded. And fuel efficiency standards were imposed for the first time. The petrodollars that flooded producing nations reshaped the Middle East. Skylines rose from the desert. Sovereign wealth funds were established. A massive transfer of wealth from consumers at the pump to governments sitting on reserves. And this is where oil touches your life directly. Oil isn't just fuel for cars. It's the cost of shipping your food, heating your home, making fertilizer for the crops, manufacturing the plastic in the device you're watching this on. An oil price spike doesn't just raise the price of gasoline. It behaves like a hidden tax on everything you buy and a transfer to producers. That's why the shocks of the 70s reached into every household, every grocery store, every factory floor. The producers seized the valve. For the first time, the countries that owned the oil also controlled the price, and the world economy shook. But high prices have consequences, and the response was already building. The 70s taught the world a brutal lesson, and the world responded. High prices had incentivized new supply, North Sea platforms, Alaskan pipelines, and crushed demand through efficiency gains. By the mid-80s, the market was oversupplied. Saudi Arabia tried to defend prices by cutting its own production, from 10 million barrels a day down to under 3. But it only lost market share while other producers kept pumping. Saudi Arabia learned a brutal truth. If you cut alone, you pay the cost alone. In 1985, Riyadh reversed course and flooded the market. Prices collapsed, devastating every oil-dependent economy on the planet. Mexico entered a debt crisis. Nigeria's oil boom turned to bust. But the biggest casualty was in Moscow. The Soviet Union depended on oil exports for hard currency. When prices cratered, the money stopped. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union would cease to exist. The Saudi decision is often cited as one major factor in the Soviet unraveling, though historians disagree on how decisive it was. Either way, a pricing decision in Riyadh had redrawn the map. And then, something fundamental changed. This is where oil stops being a barrel and becomes a number. One that can crash a country before a single tanker moves. In 1983, the New York Mercantile Exchange launched crude oil futures. Think of a futures contract as a reservation. You lock in a price today for oil delivered later. The problem in 2020 was that everyone tried to cancel their reservation at the same time, and there was nowhere to put the oil. But we'll come back to that. From this point on, oil prices would be decided by people who never touch oil. Then the market discovered something. Once oil was tradable on screens, it became fightable every single day. Futures didn't create volatility. They made it visible and tradable and gave hedgers tools to manage risk. But they shifted where prices were discovered. No longer in OPEC boardrooms or company headquarters. On screens, in real time. The power to set prices had slipped out of anyone's hands. Two benchmarks emerged as the yardsticks. Brent, priced off North Sea crude and used as the global reference, and WTI, the US domestic benchmark. Every oil headline you've ever read is measured against one of these two numbers. So at this point, the valve has split. Producers control the barrels, markets control the price, and the two are fighting in public every day. But neither side expected what happened next, because a revolution was brewing underground in Texas. First, the Supercycle. China was building the equivalent of a new Chicago every year. Steel, concrete, and diesel demand on a scale the world had never seen. Oil climbed from around $20 a barrel in 2001 past $50, past $100, all the way to $147 in July 2008. In 6 months, it crashed below $30. The greatest commodity boom in modern history, followed by the fastest collapse. Your fuel costs, your flight prices, your grocery bill, whiplashed by a single number on a screen. The winners weren't the ones with the most oil. They were the ones with timing, and timing was about to get a lot faster. Then Texas discovered the one weapon OPEC can't embargo: speed. For decades, everyone knew there was oil locked in shale rock across Texas, North Dakota, and beyond. The problem was getting it out at a price that made sense. Then hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling changed the economics almost overnight. By the late 2000s, the United States was among the world's top producers, and often number one. Shale is fundamentally different from conventional oil. It's short cycle. Rigs respond to price signals in months, not the decade-long timelines of deepwater or Arctic projects. That means every price spike now triggers a supply response from Texas within weeks. OPEC can cut production, but shale responds fast enough to blunt the spike. Russia joined Saudi Arabia in the OPEC Plus alliance to manage this new reality, but the old playbook no longer works the way it used to. And then came the moment we started with. April 2020. The pandemic crushed demand worldwide. Storage tanks at Cushing filled to capacity, the same delivery point that underpins every WTI contract. Remember the reservation analogy? Every trader holding a May contract suddenly needed to cancel. But the restaurant was full and there was no back door. On April 20th, futures settled at negative $37. Producers were paying buyers to take oil off their hands, the most valuable commodity of the 20th century. And for one day, it was worth less than nothing. The recovery brought new volatility and a louder question. The world is under growing pressure to decarbonize: EVs, renewables, climate policy, and yet global oil consumption continues to rise. Most of oil isn't gasoline. It's the diesel in your delivery trucks, the jet fuel in your flights, the fertilizer in your food, and the plastics in the device you're watching this on. That's why quitting is harder than it sounds. The valve doesn't sit in one place anymore, which is exactly why nobody can stabilize it. And that might be the most dangerous configuration of all. For 160 years, one man controlled the valve, then states took it by force, then markets tore it loose, and now it's split between geology, geopolitics, and a world trying to quit oil while still depending on it for everything. Oil is the only commodity that is simultaneously energy, money, and power. Even the energy transition runs on it, mining the lithium, shipping the turbines, paving the roads. We are trying to replace the densest portable energy source we ever found, while we still rely on it to build the replacement. So the question isn't whether oil's era will end. It's what happens in the decades while we figure out what comes next.